The drive from Brunswick to Jessup takes 40 minutes on a clear morning. That day, with rain hammering the highway, and my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. It felt like 40 years. I had been running late from the moment I left my driveway. I took the wrong coat. I forgot my reading glasses on the kitchen counter. Twice I nearly turned around, because some quiet, stubborn part of me still couldn't believe what I was about to walk into. But I kept driving. The woman who had called me the night before had said I was running out of time, and something in her voice, steady, certain and sad in a way that didn't belong to a stranger, made me believe her. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of Keller and Associates on Savannah Highway, I saw my husband Franklin's silver pickup truck already there. Of course, it was. He had left the house that morning before I finished my first cup of coffee, telling me he had a meeting. He hadn't said where. He hadn't said with whom. In the last several months, Franklin had stopped telling me a great many things. I pushed through the glass front door, soaking wet, my umbrella having given up somewhere between the car and the entrance. The receptionist looked up with the careful expression of someone trained to manage situations before they become scenes. "I need to see my husband," I said. "Franklin Beaumont." Something passed over her face. Recognition, I thought, or maybe relief. She was on her feet before I finished speaking. "Conference room 2, she said quietly. "Down the hall." I didn't wait for her to lead me. The door was partially open. I pushed it the rest of the way. Franklin sat at the far end of a polished table, a pen in his right hand, his reading glasses on, a stack of documents arranged in front of him with little yellow signature flags poking up from the edges. 3 other people sat around the table, a younger man in a gray suit, a woman I recognized immediately and wished I didn't, and an older gentleman I had never seen before. Franklin looked up. His face did something complicated. Not shock, not quite guilt. Something closer to a man who had rehearsed this moment and found, now that it had arrived, that he still wasn't ready for it. "Clarice," he set the pen down slowly, "you shouldn't have come." "Those are the first true words you've said to me in months," I told him. "Because you never wanted me to know, did you?" He didn't answer. The woman across the table, Brenda Colton, his business partner, whose name had been appearing in his phone more and more over the past year, folded her hands and said, pleasantly and terribly, "Mrs. Beaumont, there's no reason for this to become emotional." And I thought, everything in my life that I love is on that table in front of him, and you are asking me not to feel anything about it. But I didn't arrive at that moment overnight. And this story deserves to be told from the beginning. My name is Clarice Beaumont. I turned 61 last April, and I spent most of that birthday quietly. Just Franklin and me on the back porch of the farmhouse, watching fireflies come up from the orchard the way they always do in summer. Franklin made his mother's lemon cake from memory. He got the frosting slightly wrong, the way he always does. We sat outside until almost 10 o'clock, and I remember thinking that this, the fireflies, the cake, the man beside me, who still made me laugh after 37 years, was everything I had ever needed a birthday to be. I hold on to that evening now, the way you hold on to something you know you will need later. Franklin and I met in Savannah in the summer of 1987. I was 24 and newly hired as a librarian at the elementary school on Waters Avenue. He was 27, already running his own small contracting business, already the kind of man who showed up exactly when he said he would and fixed things the right way the first time. We met at a church fish fry. I knocked a cup of sweet tea off the table reaching for the cornbread, and he caught it before it hit the floor without even pausing his conversation. I thought, I want to know a person whose reflexes work like that. We married 14 months later. Not a big wedding. Just our families, our closest friends, and a tent in the backyard of the farm that had belonged to my family since my grandfather Horace planted the first peach trees in 1951. That farm is the thing you need to understand about this story. It was never just land. It was every summer I spent as a child learning the names of the trees from my grandmother Luella. It was the kitchen where my mother canned preserves every August and the porch where my father read the newspaper every single morning until he died. When my parents passed, they left the farm to me. Not to me and Franklin, though he had poured years of his own sweat and love into that property. To me. That was their specific intention. I had never thought to explain it, because Franklin had never given me reason to. He was proud of that farm. When we harvested in late summer, he was out in the orchard before sunrise. When the old barn needed a new roof, he spent 3 weekends in July heat putting it on himself. Our son Joel grew up climbing those peach trees. Our daughter, Annette, pressed her first wildflower from the ones that grew along the back fence. I never imagined anyone might try to take it. The changes in Franklin started slowly enough that I almost missed them entirely. Looking back, I can identify the first sign clearly. He began carrying his cell phone everywhere. For most of our marriage, Franklin treated his phone like a mild inconvenience. He'd leave it on the workbench, in the truck, on the back porch. Suddenly, it was always in his pocket, always face down on the table, and, whenever it rang, while I was in the room, he would stand and walk toward the garage before answering. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I chose, for a while, to trust him instead. My best friend Vera Hutchins. We had known each other since our first year teaching at the same school, back when neither of us had a single gray hair. Came for coffee one Tuesday morning in early spring and asked me, in that careful way she has when she's worried about being wrong, whether Franklin was working again. He retired 2 years ago, I said. I know. She stirred her coffee slowly. I saw him at the waterfront last Thursday. He was having lunch with a woman I didn't recognize. I almost said hello, but they looked. She hesitated, focused. I told myself it was a business contact. Franklin had spent 30 years building a reputation in coastal Georgia. People still called him for advice, still asked his opinion on projects, long after he hung up his contractor's license. There was nothing unusual about lunch with someone from the old days. I told myself that for 3 weeks. One afternoon, I was in the guest room changing linens when I heard his voice drifting up from his office downstairs. The door was closed, but sound carries in old farmhouses. She won't be a problem, he said. A pause. She doesn't know anything about the amendment yet. Another pause, longer this time. I just need 2 more weeks. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding a pillowcase, and did not move for a very long time. When he came out of his office an hour later, he seemed perfectly at ease. He asked what I wanted for dinner, told me there was a good movie on cable, kissed my cheek on the way past. I stood in the hallway watching him and thought, this man has been the safest person in my life for 37 years. I must have misunderstood. But misunderstandings don't hide themselves in your own bank. I had gone in to ask about renewing a certificate of deposit. Nothing out of the ordinary. Our account manager, a woman named Donna Riggs, who had handled our accounts for nearly 15 years, pulled up our records and then went very still. Donna, I said, what's wrong? She turned the screen slightly away from me. A small motion. She probably didn't realize she'd done it. Mrs. Beaumont, she said carefully. There are some changes to certain accounts that you'd need to discuss with Mr. Beaumont directly. I'm not able to share details on accounts where your authorization has been adjusted. The words settled over me like cold water. Adjusted, I said. I'm sorry, I truly am. I drove home without turning on the radio. I parked in the driveway and sat for 10 minutes looking at the farmhouse my father rebuilt after the storm in 1979, the porch where Franklin had proposed to me under the wisteria. I had thought of it as ours for so long that the possibility of it being in danger had simply never entered my mind. I called our family attorney, a man named Clark Middleton, who had handled our legal matters for nearly 20 years. His assistant answered warmly. And then I gave my name, and the warmth shifted to something else. I'm sorry, Mrs. Beaumont. Mr. Middleton isn't available to schedule appointments with the Beaumont family at this time. At this time, I repeated. I'm sorry, that's all I can say. I sat in the kitchen that evening and watched Franklin make dinner and act like a man with nothing on his mind at all. I watched him move around the kitchen he had renovated with his own hands 12 years ago, replaced every cabinet, because I had mentioned once that the old ones were difficult to reach. And I thought about 37 years of a man I would have sworn on anything I held sacred that I knew completely. That night, after he went upstairs, I stood in the doorway of his office. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I told myself that. But a leather-bound folder on the corner of his desk caught my eye, and I opened it. Inside were documents with the heading Colton Development Group, LLC, and beneath that, a sheet with the title I read 3 times before it fully arrived. Property Transfer and Conveyance Agreement, Beaumont Farm, Glynn County, Georgia. My name was typed on a signature line. I had not signed it. I went back upstairs. I lay down in the dark beside my husband and did not sleep. The next morning I called Vera. I told her everything. She sat with me for 2 hours without once trying to offer an explanation, which was the only response that could have helped. Before she left, she looked at me with the expression of someone who loves you enough to say the one thing you haven't let yourself say out loud yet. You have to find out what this is, Clarice, before it's finished. That evening my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer. A young woman's voice. Steady, but careful in the way of someone choosing each word deliberately. Mrs. Beaumont, you don't know me. A pause, but I know what my mother is planning to do. Every nerve in my body went quiet. What does that mean? I asked. The signing is tomorrow morning. Keller and Associates on Savannah Highway. If you're not there before 11. She stopped. Started again. My mother has been pushing Mr. Beaumont toward this for almost a year. He believes she's protecting his interests. She isn't. Another pause. I'm sorry. I couldn't not call you. The line went silent. I sat in the half-dark of the living room for a long time. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all week finally arrived. I didn't sleep. I lay beside Franklin and listened to him breathe, the way I had listened to him breathe for 37 years. And I made myself stay still and quiet until the clock read 5:15. Then I got up, dressed in the dark, and walked out into the rain. The drive that should have taken 40 minutes took over an hour. I missed a turn twice. The storm was the kind that coastal Georgia produces in July. Total and relentless, loud enough against the windshield that I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I kept driving. I arrived at 10:51. The receptionist sent me down the hall without asking twice. And that is where I found my husband, Franklin Beaumont, the man who burned dinner on our 3rd date, because he was too busy making me laugh to watch the stove, the man who held my hand through 2 labors and my mother's last days, and every hard season of our life together. Sitting at a table with a pen in his hand, about to sign away land that my grandmother had loved. He looked up, he saw me. He set the pen down slowly. You shouldn't have come, he said. I know, I answered. You made sure of that. Before anyone could speak again, the conference room door opened a second time. The man who stepped in was perhaps 70 years old, with white hair and a dark overcoat, damp at the shoulders. He carried a worn briefcase and an expression of complete composure. The composure of someone who has seen the inside of enough rooms like this one to no longer be unsettled by any of them. He looked at Franklin first, then at me, then at the documents on the table. I believe I arrived just in time, he said quietly. My name is Edmund Hartley. And before any signature touches any of those pages, there are a number of things this room needs to hear. Brenda Colton rose from her chair. This is a private proceeding, Mr. Hartley. You have no standing here. Edmund set his briefcase on the table and opened it without hurrying. I represented Horace and Luella Prescott beginning in 1968, he said, and their daughter Marion Prescott Beaumont until her passing 12 years ago. He looked at me. You are Clarice, aren't you? Marion's daughter. I couldn't speak for a moment. Yes, I finally said. I thought I recognized the name when I received a call last night. He removed several folders, each with color-coded tabs. Your grandmother was very specific in her estate documents about the nature of the Prescott land and its intended protections. Your mother reinforced those provisions in 2008. He slid a folder toward the attorney in the gray suit. I believe you'll find the transfer currently on this table is legally defective. In 3 separate ways. The attorney opened the folder. His expression changed within 30 seconds. Brenda glanced at Franklin. For the first time all morning, she looked uncertain. Franklin had not moved. Franklin, I said, what have you done? He set down the pen. What he had done came out over the following 2 hours in that room. And then over the following weeks in offices across Savannah. 2 years after retiring from his contracting business, Franklin had agreed to partner with Brenda Colton on a coastal resort development project. Boutique, hotel, waterfront access, the kind of opportunity that sounds sound when someone you trust is describing it across a restaurant table. He had invested their retirement savings incrementally, not all at once, small enough withdrawals that none of them, individually, looked alarming. By the time the project began collapsing under permit failure and a market that had shifted, he owed nearly $800,000 to Brenda's LLC. Brenda had offered him a path forward. Transfer the farm as collateral, restructure the debt, recover everything over time. She had arranged the attorneys, the paperwork, the timeline. She had counseled Franklin, in emails Edmund later produced, to handle the matter quietly, to avoid causing me unnecessary distress, to present me with the resolution rather than the problem. She had called it, in one of those emails, keeping the process clean. I was the process she wanted to keep clean. Edmund dismantled the transfer documents methodically. My grandmother's estate had been structured with a legal restraint, a provision that prevented the land from being conveyed outside the direct family line without conditions that had plainly not been satisfied. My mother had reinforced those protections in her own filing. The transfer, as written, would not have survived a serious review. Which is why, Edmund noted, without raising his voice even slightly, it had been important that no one familiar with the underlying estate history be involved in drafting the documents. Brenda said nothing. Franklin stared at the table. After Edmund had requested the other attorneys step out, after Brenda left the room with her own counsel, after the door closed and left us alone, at the end of that long, polished table, I looked at the man I had married and waited. How long? I asked. 18 months. His voice was barely there. You've been carrying this for 18 months, Franklin. Yes. I thought about everything that had happened in those 18 months. Holidays. Our anniversary dinner at the place on River Street. Joel and his wife visiting in November. Annette calling every Sunday evening without fail. And through all of it, Franklin had been carrying this alone, adding another layer of pretending every single day. Why didn't you tell me? I said. It wasn't really a question. He pressed his palms flat on the table. Because I thought about your face. He stopped. Your grandmother planted those trees, Clarice. Your mother trusted you with that land. And I was going to be the man who lost it. He closed his eyes. I couldn't figure out how to be that man in front of you. I sat with those words. You made a decision for both of us, I finally said. You decided I would fall apart. You decided I couldn't stand beside you in a crisis. You decided that keeping me in the dark was the same as keeping me safe. I looked directly at him. Those are not the same thing, Franklin. They were never the same thing. He didn't answer right away. I know that now, he said, and in the way he said it, not as a defense, just as a plain statement of something he had finally understood. I believed him. Annette drove up from Atlanta that evening, without asking a single question over the phone. She walked through the front door, set down her bag, and wrapped both arms around me and held on. Joel arrived from Raleigh the next morning. We sat in the living room with the TV off, and I told them everything. Neither of them interrupted once. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Joel looked at his father. You told me something when I was a kid, he said. You said the worst thing a man can do when he breaks something valuable is hide it, because the damage doesn't stop just because he stopped looking at it. Franklin nodded slowly. What were you hiding from, Dad? From being the man who failed her, Franklin said. From watching her look at me differently. Joel said, you were already that man the moment you chose the secret over the truth. The silence that followed was the most honest thing I had witnessed in months. Franklin moved his things to the guest room that night. Not because I asked. Because he understood, finally, that I needed room to breathe. And that understanding, arriving without being asked, arriving too late and still arriving, was the first sign that the man I had married was still somewhere inside the one who had let me down. The legal work took several more weeks. Edmund worked with an accountant and a property attorney to untangle everything Brenda Colton had constructed. The farm was never truly in danger once the estate documents were reviewed, but we hadn't known that, and Brenda had apparently built her entire plan around the assumption that we wouldn't find out in time. Several of her emails, which surfaced during the review, made plain that she had known about the estate protections and had structured the transfer specifically to move faster than any scrutiny could catch up to. She submitted a statement 2 weeks later, claiming she had simply followed Franklin's instructions. She did not acknowledge those emails. She did not call. Franklin read her statement at the kitchen table and set it down without a word. She told me she was protecting my family, he said finally. Not a defense. Just someone watching a version of himself he could barely recognize. She was protecting an asset, Edmund said, not unkindly. From the inside, those two things can feel identical. We resolved the financial damage the only way available to us. We liquidated a portion of our retirement accounts, sold a small rental property Franklin had owned since before our marriage, and renegotiated the debt with the remaining lenders. Franklin and I sat at the kitchen table and made every one of those decisions together, out loud, with all the numbers on the table between us. It was hard, it was humbling, and in a way I hadn't anticipated, it was necessary. We had never once sat at that table and spoken plainly about money, about fear, about what we would do if something went wrong. Not in 37 years. I hadn't known that was something we had been missing. Edmund called me on a clear Tuesday morning in early fall to tell me that no transfers had been executed, that the farm title was clean, and that the restructuring had been accepted by all parties. I walked outside after we hung up and sat on the porch steps. The peach harvest was long over, but the trees were still beautiful in that way trees have in September, just beginning to think about changing. The trees Luella Prescott planted, the land she loved, still here. I had not cried much through any of this. I had been too busy, too angry, too tired. I cried then. Franklin found me there a few minutes later. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down on the step below mine and stayed. After a while he said, I want to show you every account, every statement, every document we own. I want you involved in every single financial decision going forward. I should have been doing that from the beginning. Yes, I said, you should have. I know. I need you to understand something. I looked at him. I'm not angry because you made a mistake. People make mistakes, Franklin. I'm angry because you decided, on your own, without asking me, that I was too fragile to make them alongside you. He looked at me, the way he had looked at me on our best days, fully and without any deflection. I understand that now, he said. I know you do. I looked back at the orchard. The understanding coming late is the part that's going to take longest. He nodded. He didn't try to rush it. He stayed on the step below mine and was still, and in that, the not rushing, the willingness to sit inside something unresolved. I recognized the man I had married, frightened, flawed, capable of spectacular foolishness. Capable, too, of something real. Edmund Hartley sent me a handwritten note after the case closed, on the kind of good stationery that a certain generation of attorneys still uses. The last line read, The deepest protection you can offer the things you love is not secrecy. It is the honesty to name what threatens them. I read it, standing at the kitchen window, morning light coming across the orchard, the trees my grandmother planted visible through the glass. The porch where my father sat every morning. The cabinets Franklin installed because I mentioned once that the old ones were hard to reach. Everything I love, still standing. I used to believe it was the land that held us. What I understand now is that it was never the land at all. It was the willingness to be honest with each other about what we were afraid of losing. The land can be survived. That willingness, once broken, has to be rebuilt deliberately. The same way you rebuild anything. One true thing at a time. Every morning, no matter what the day before looked like. Franklin and I are choosing that now. Together, and with our eyes open. That is not a small thing. After everything, it is everything.